Paul had a direction. There was in a general sense, a plan. And we'll pick that up on in terms of a strategy. Paul was thinking big, and he seemed to have a specific direction. And it comes out as a geographic strategy. He saw his ministry in terms of geographic expansion. And in modern terms, we would call that's a strategy. You know, if you've got a business and you're trying to expand its market into new geographical areas, you're talking about a strategy, a marketing strategy, or even more than that. And so, yeah, there's something quite intentional and quite long-term in the way that Paul is viewing his ministry. Now, it's interesting in Acts, Luke talks about the cities that Paul is ministering in. And of course, both Luke and Paul would know, which province those cities were in. But Luke doesn't talk about, oh, we crossed the border into so-and-so. They're jumping mostly, except maybe to Macedonia, they're going from city to city. When Paul writes to people and when he describes both where he's been and where he wants to go, he talks about provinces. Going back to that map a few minutes ago. He sees his Roman world in terms of provinces going across that sphere. And that's an interesting combination because these two guys are very close. They obviously spent a lot of time together. Obviously talked together a lot because Luke could write down all that had taken place even that he hadn't seen. And so we sort of get this sense that cities are critical. They're gonna live in cities and work mostly in cities. A few smaller cities, but most of them were fairly significant. The more significant the city, the more likely they spent a long time there. And we also know that Paul talks about the fact that while he was ministering in a city, the gospel got out, not just in the city, but out across that province. So is again that a form of strategy? We're going to focus on influential cities from which we can then begin to evangelize a whole province. Now, the cities that they spend the most time in had Roman law. Paul had legal protection in those cities. They had the Greek language. Paul was fluent in the market language, at least, and the philosophical language of that city. As far as we can tell, just about every city they went to had a Jewish community. And Paul often started there when he begins his ministry, even though his intention is to go through that community into the surrounding Greek pagan communities. But again, Paul is this Old Testament scholar. He's found people that will welcome him in and give him a chance to teach. And every one of these places is on a trade route. Paul had to make a living. So I think all four of those are critical pieces to why Paul went to where he went and why he was in a city. There's law. There's probably a small Roman garrison there, at least, if not a large one. Some of the cities, there's a huge Roman garrison. So there's the law, and as a citizen of Rome, he has protection, and we see that come up in the story. He's able to converse with people, both to do business and to share the gospel with people in those cities. He can fit into and break into relationships through the Jewish community, and there's enough trade going on that he can probably stop and begin doing his trade very, very quickly without any disruption, because it wasn't like, oh, well, we just fled this city over there and we walked 3 days and got over here and the first thing I did was go to the ATM. There wasn't anything like that. And probably you didn't want to be walking around with, oh yeah, we were carrying $20,000 with us. A couple of men walking with that much money probably didn't make a lot of sense. So I think this again was a part of a larger strategy, a strategy of location, a strategy of support, a strategy of communication, all of those things. There's protection, there's ease of communication, there was, in many cases, a prepared audience who hopefully were longing for a Messiah. There is the making of a living by performing your trade. And then from that city, there's also the influence of this message spreading out to a larger area, even the whole province. Sounds rather intentional to me. Well, a friend of mine who was training missionaries about church planting movements, CPMs, used this map to talk about, in a sense, that's what Paul was doing. He's going in and establishing an area of influence, a base of operations, you might say, a place where he's both proclaiming the good news, and as people believe, he's training them. And we know of numerous places where they then go and either start a church or do ministry in another place, maybe in that same general area or province, or maybe they go off somewhere else. So I think that's a legitimate way to consider these cities where they're doing ministry. This is a center of influence where the church is planted and it can begin to start reproducing in other areas. So let's talk briefly about Damascus, the first place he gets to after that event on the road. And that story tells us that immediately upon arriving there and being healed of his blindness, he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues. It didn't take Paul years and months to figure this out. Once taking his Old Testament background, his expertise, and then seeing that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, he could immediately jump in and begin to preach very powerfully. Now, we know from government statistics that about 30 years later, there were approximately 10,000 Jews in Damascus. We don't know exactly the number at this time, but it seems like it would very likely be a similar number. So there's a significant population there that he was going there to catch anybody who was a Christian and bring them back in chains to Jerusalem. So there's a big population there. And the letters that he was carrying from the leaders in Jerusalem would have been well received by most of these Orthodox Jews in the city. And again, it's just sort of striking to us today because we don't think of this happening very often. But again, as I've shared with you a little bit, we sometimes see this. We see people who are, let's say, Muslims, who are Quranic teachers, who hear the gospel, and finally everything comes together and they realize that Jesus is who they've really been looking for. And it doesn't take them long to start powerfully proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah. And so that's exactly what happened with Paul in Damascus. So if you want to know what I think the first missionary journey is, I'd have to say it's Damascus. He goes there and he does the mission that Jesus was sending him to do. And it was a place of great opportunity and need. So why isn't that the very first of the missionary journeys? And we're going to see this pattern developing, but it's the first place where he caused enough trouble, the Jewish leaders began to plot to kill him. They were embarrassed by the fact that he was a greater Old Testament scholar. He could run circles around them using their own logic and teaching in history and Old Testament. And, if you're really mad and you can't shut some guy up, well, okay, we'll just kill him. And that's exactly what they were planning to do. And it's going to happen again. But this is the first time that happens. And as a result of that, Paul goes to Arabia. Now, Arabia is on the edge of the empire, but it's still within the sphere of Roman influence. And the Arabs are a Semitic people. They're, sort of distant cousins to the Jews, sons of Abraham and that kind of thing. And so why not, if you were going to one of the nations, why wouldn't that be the first place you might head off to? And so Paul says in Galatians that he fled to Arabia from that threat on his life in Damascus. It's the closest Gentile area, and it had a Jewish community. So again, he can go and get welcomed, especially if he goes quickly before word gets out about what he's been doing in Damascus. That becomes a problem, I think, later in his ministry. But at this point, he shows up. He is Saul of Tarsus and a student of Gamaliel. They're going to hand one of the Old Testament scrolls to him and say, "Teach us today." And of course, he wouldn't take him long to be preaching the gospel to them. Actually, in the Old Testament, and again, Paul would know this as an expert in the Old Testament, that Isaiah mentions Kedar, which is the Arabs, and Selah, which is the city of Petra in Arabia, as places that will exalt the Lord. These are specific prophecies. The Arabs are going to be people who know about God deeply and are going to bring him glory. And actually, in the first centuries before Islam rose, there was a significant church among Arab-speaking people in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, we're not told about the success that happened there, but there almost had to be some success, because it resulted in the Arab king Aretas sending envoys chasing him when he fled from there back to Damascus to seize him and bring him back in chains. Listen, those envoys were sent exactly like he was to the city of Damascus. Now he's gone to Arabia. He's not been hiding in a cave. He's been doing what he always does when he's on mission. He goes, he finds somebody who will listen to him, he starts preaching. Some people start believing. The Jewish community probably rises up in anger, and they complain to the king, and now the king wants to settle this dispute because he wants his Jewish community to be happy, and the quickest way to do that probably would have been to kill Paul. And so all the evidence here is that Paul is doing what he keeps doing for the next 30 or more years. He immediately took up that call, and so it seems to me that Arabia is the second missionary journey. And we see this pattern in this journey, even though we're not told a lot about in Arabia. We see why he went there, and we see what's happened as he comes out. It appears he must have gone and been a bold witness. There was response that resulted in persecution, and then again he had to flee, like we're going to see repeatedly through the book of Acts and mentioned repeatedly in his epistles, right? Then after he gets back, he did flee to Damascus, but now they've got envoys from the king in Arabia looking for him. So he flees again and he goes to Jerusalem. Now, again, he's been doing this for several years now on his own. He's not met the other apostles yet. And he states in Galatians that he wanted to go visit Cephas or Peter, and he wanted to check out his message and his calling. It's not that he seems to doubt it. He just maybe a double check, I don't know. But and also to learn. It must have been a lot of questions. Remember, the Gospels hadn't been written, and he had to have questions. So he went and he found Cephas. And while he's in Jerusalem, he states that he preached Christ boldly in the city. And again, because he's a Hellenist, he speaks Greek, he seems to be preaching especially in the Hellenistic synagogues, which there were a lot in the city. Remember, the 12 had been there all along, and they're not as conversant in Greek or Greek culture as Paul is. So this made a lot of sense. He he picked the Jewish community in Jerusalem that had a lot less witness, and he starts preaching quite boldly to them. Then we're told that he decided to travel around Judea. Now that's just the surrounding areas, the province around. So I don't necessarily think this is a whole separate trip, but he must have spent some time doing this, because he talks about he's traveling doing this around. It wasn't one stop or one place. It looks like a significant amount of time spent trying to tell people about Jesus again in the area of Judea. And once again, he's successful in evangelizing. And when people come to Christ, people who don't come to Christ often react negatively. And so now there came another threat to his life. And so at this point, the Christians, because Paul is attracting all the wrong attention on them perhaps, let's get him away and send him back to his hometown. So now we have, okay, let's just see where we are. He's called on the road. He goes to Damascus. That's a mission trip. Then he goes to Arabia. That's 2, right? At least 2. And then he comes back. I'm not going to count Damascus because it looks like he was just passing through and he realized that they're chasing me again. So he runs to Jerusalem, and then while he's there, he's also preaching in Judea. So I would say Jerusalem, Judea is the 3rd missionary journey, right? And now, because he's been successful, he's already a good missionary. The church there helps him escape and sends him on to Tarsus, his hometown. Now, Tarsus is in Cilicia. That's the Roman province. And it was a significant city. And in the Acts account, from 930 to 1125, Paul is in Tarsus. Now, it's not describing in detail what he's up to. This is the time period. Other things are happening. And it looks like this could very well have been a period of 6 to 8 years. And again, considering not that Paul went to Tarsus to, lean on his family or get rich in the family business, even though he was probably working like that, Paul immediately took up his calling to the nations. And so why would he not then, going to his hometown, begin to do the same pattern of ministry? There's a Jewish community there. He is an Old Testament scholar, a student of Gamaliel. Why would we consider that he wouldn't go there and immediately start preaching there, and then maybe preaching more and more to the people of Tarsus through those contacts? And this has taken place for a while. Now in Galatians 1, Paul's talking about his ministry, and he states he was actively preaching during this time period, not just hanging around, not just making money, though that he certainly had to be doing that too, but he is fulfilling his calling immediately from the beginning, just like he said repeatedly. If you read through all the things that Paul lists of the terrible things that have happened to him, he talks about being beaten almost to death by the Jewish leaders. Since that's not specifically what seems to have happened anywhere in Acts otherwise, this is the most likely time that Paul was beaten like that, even in his hometown again. So later on, after Barnabas comes gets them, they go to Antioch, and then they go out on their first missionary journey, and then they go and report to Jerusalem. And they're talking to the church in Jerusalem about all the places that God has been working among the Gentiles. And they include believers in Syria, which is probably Antioch and its surrounding area, and Cilicia, which is most likely Tarsus. So Tarsus and Cilicia is a missionary journey, and it appears to be one of the longest places Paul stayed during any of the time that he's called to be a missionary.